thought maybe the passage was complete, but Stacy covered for me last week and said it might be worthwhile to spend a little more time on it. So if you're not too weary of spending some time on emptiness, we'll spend some time on emptiness. Let me try to frame this a little bit, maybe in a broader context, and then we'll go into it. We're on page 78 in the text, and we're in the middle of things, in media res here, and what's happening at this stage, a number of spiritual cultivators are coming to this great master for guidance and direction, advice, because they're all seriously undertaking a really genuine journey of, you could call it a spiritual journey, but it's a human existential journey to really figure out what it's all about. And it's not just a curiosity they have for what it's all about, to know really what's going on. And even in a positive sense, not much such an itch to know what it's all about, because we find ourselves born into a situation where there's just a lot that doesn't make sense on its face. Starting with the fact that we're floating around on a little speck of dirt in the void. I mean, that itself is a little mind-boggling, and you just keep going from there. And there's also a positive sense of curiosity or wonder that they have. But underneath this is also, and I'm saying this because I don't think it's just pertaining to this time in the Tang Dynasty. I think these are universal elements of human existence. Is underlying this and framing it a little bit is this sense of urgency, that almost the sense that we have that we're like a candle that's lit, and each day it's burning down, burning down, burning down, and it's not going to last forever. And so we find ourselves with this immense curiosity. On the other hand, this really deep, unknowing uncertainty about what it is, what makes sense, what it is we should do in this interval we have. And so there's a lot of factors bearing down, and this is across cultures and across time. From the early Greeks, you can see concern with this and questions about this from the pre-Socratics on. You see it in figures like Gandhi, Tolstoy, wonderful writings about concerns with these questions. Martin Luther begins his spiritual, really, journey facing the fact that at 19 or 20, his young friends are dying from what then was the Black Plague. And without explanation, it seemed as if God, which he believed held everything together, had abandoned the world. And it wasn't just old people that were dying, which was the natural course of things, but children and his close friends. And so this really prompted him to begin his spiritual quest. You see the same thing happens with the Buddha in the story of Siddhartha. When he encounters these realities of aging and birth and death and sickness, he can't settle. He can't be at peace, because these existential quandaries are just gnawing at him, and not gnawing at him just intellectually. He's actually aware with each breath and each day that the time is passing, and it doesn't seem to have any meaning or purpose unless he delves into something that gets beyond just the sheer maybe mystery, or in some cases you could say the absurdity of it. And so this continues, this trend of seekers continues, following teachings and philosophies, but interestingly also seeking out mentors and sages and guides, because it's often it's very rare that somebody can do this completely on their own. And so we have a cumulative tradition or heritage from various sources that speak to this, that have advice on this. Some of it's more valuable than others. Some of it we've tried ourselves and played around with, but it's still there, it's still available. And this is probably one of the richest legacies we have of human knowledge. I mean, we have science and technology, and that's both wonderful and horrible simultaneously. But this legacy is a rich one, and that's what this book or this text is in line with that. So this person is so sincere and so dedicated. He has actually renounced a lot of the things that we hold dear. He's renounced family life. He's renounced money and pleasure. He's celibate. He has taken vows, you could say, of poverty, but it's very simple possessions. He has a robe and a bowl and a few essentials that he travels with. Other than that, and often in this case, they didn't accept money or offerings. In this case here, they probably were eating very simply, usually one meal a day of vegetarian food, to keep to a middle way that they didn't have. They got fat and sassy and forgot what they were doing, or they got too emaciated and they fell into a kind of dull emptiness. So they were really on an edge here. They're really pursuing this with their minds, their bodies, their emotions, and everything. And when this happens, that enthusiasm, that intensity can often take you over, or if you feel as if you're not making progress, you start to panic a little bit. You start to freak out and say, is this working? Is this right? Do I have signs that I'm accomplishing things? This is how I see. This is how I see it. It's not necessarily the only way to see this passage. Excuse me, I have to keep lubricated here. But I see this passage as that's it. That's where he's at. And now he's gotten to a point where he's picked up a text called the Nirvana Sutra, and he's been studying it deeply. He's been really looking into it. And he's probably memorized 2 sections. And by the way, memorization in this tradition is not just a devotional practice, it's also a form of meditation practice, because while you're meditating, your mind is not distracted by other things, so there's a focus. And then there's a content conveyance to it that is said to be somewhat efficacious, in that if you memorize it, content will open up to you at various moments unexpectedly. So it's not just that you're memorizing it as a devotional ritual or even as a teaching device that you could use for others, but it has this catalytic effect, strangely, as you memorize it. And it becomes an internal teacher, because as you memorize it and you come to practice and whatnot, it can open up points when you reach a dead end. And so he's been doing this text. This text is particularly difficult because this text is pointing to the ultimate goal, say, if you want, in this tradition, which is for what is called nirvana or nibbana. But what does that mean? And he hopes to find out what that is, because he wants to get to the end of these questions. He wants to break through, and he knows that that's presented as the goal, nirvana or nibbana. So he's working on it, but the text is not easy to penetrate. I don't know if any of you have looked at the Nirvana Sutra. Anybody? Easy, right? No, no. And the reason it's not easy is because the Buddha is trying to give advice of how to do it, but without depending on attaching to any philosophical position or religious position while you're doing it. And this is tricky. In other words, he's presenting the idea that the teachings are a raft to move you along. They're a kind of a mode of operation to move you along. But the raft in itself and the teachings themselves are not to be held as final or absolute, but rather merely as expedient devices to use. But while you're doing this, you can get anxious, because you think, well, what if it's that way? Then what is this? What am I hanging on to? What am I getting? And so, it's really a continuation of the Four Truths, if you think about it. What the Buddha presents, going back to this, is that as we meet life, and as I'm saying it, as we meet life through a construction of an ego, okay, a false self, which is so simply ingrained and seemingly obvious we never challenge it. Once we start with that premise, we experience life as a series of dissatisfactions. Even when there's joy and pleasure, ultimately there's an underlying dissatisfaction because they fade away. they drift. And even if we can acquire and hold them for longer than usual, maybe till we're 70 or 80, inevitably, we pass. So no matter what you acquire, you can have all the great insurance policies, all the great medicine, it's all stocked up, and you got a castle that's impenetrable, and you'll die, and that stuff will go on, but you won't. So that sense of dissatisfaction is deep. It's not just physical, it's emotional and deeply psychological. And then the Buddha said, the reason for this is fundamental misperception, misunderstanding. The question that we're confronting is framed wrong, which he calls avidya, not seeing things clearly. Wrongly, I think, translated as ignorance. It doesn't mean ignorance in that sense. It means a fundamental misunderstanding of the way things are. This, in turn, feeds an anxiety that leads to craving and attachment, because then we're frantic to get something in place of this. And therefore, the next one he says, and the third one, truth, is really interesting. There is an end to this. There is a gate out. There's moksha. There's a liberation from, this pulsing cycle, which is called nirvana, nibbana. And then the fourth truth is, how do you actually realize that? And this is where it's critical in the teaching. The Buddha himself says, I can't give it to you. It is not something that can be given. So I'm not being stingy and saying I could, but I'm not. It's like, it cannot be given. It can only be directly realized by each individual, him or herself. And the Buddha said that directly. He said, all I can do is show you the way that I myself have walked, in the hopes that you might consider it interesting and take it up yourselves. But that's the only way to get to the end of this. So that becomes the fourth truth, the eightfold way. The way to do this becomes the methodology, the mechanism, if you want to use a word, that actually you put into practice. You do something. Now, in doing this, it seems like it's very clear. But as you pursue this, habits and attachments, deep, there's different words for it. The general Sanskrit word is klesha. And klesha means anything that impedes or obstructs the innate ability to awake, for bodhi. These are largely emotional and psychological and behavioral qualities. They're the stuff of great literature: greed, jealousy, hatred, animosity, laziness. Any others? Jealousy, envy, 7 deadly sins, whatever you got. These are, and they're not like abstract. They're very real, right? They make for good drama on TV and movies. But hidden in there is very interesting, is another part of klesha, and this has to do with a more intellectual, and they're called views. And this is very important because, and it doesn't mean just an outlook you have or an opinion you have. These are deeply charged ways, fundamental ways you have of looking at something that can either be conducive to getting moksha or liberation or not. And so this was your question the last time I was here. Is this sort of an orthodoxy or a dogma, or the right view being, how did you put it? It was sort of like belief, or yeah.
I'm trying to remember myself, I can't remember.
Well, the idea was, it seems like, okay, if this is orthopraxic and it's in the doing, this seems a little orthodoxic, because it seems rightness on the basis of it being stated as true. But we pointed out, and this is very important to understand, these views that the Buddha is talking about are not right or wrong because they are a priori right or wrong, but they're right or wrong because they function or they don't function to produce liberation. In other words, they're dynamically wrong because they actually don't get you to where you're wanting to go. Now, if you're not wanting to go, you can just hang out with these views all the time. But if you're wanting to move along and get liberated, he's saying these particular views, if held, and Nagarjuna said it, sort of one view is if you have a wrong view of emptiness. If you don't get emptiness and you think it's some negative, depressive, fundamental nihilism, he says it's like grabbing a poisonous snake at the wrong end. In other words, you get bit by it. So views are important. Now, next week, I always do this, we'll go into this in more depth, okay? And the reason we'll go into the more depth, because if you turn the page This is my attempt at trailers with sutras. If you turn the page, you'll see this verse, and this verse is a wowie zowie. This is a, did you go over this, Stacy? Okay. But you'll notice if you go down about 7 or 8 lines, you say the root of the 62 wrong views. Do you see that line? The root of the 62 wrong views. So this is actually meant to be an actual list, and it's worthwhile looking into. So that's why I wanted to say, because it's really quite exact. But generally, what they have to do with is going back to the second noble truth, which is the fundamental misunderstanding we have about who is this and what is that. Okay? Who is this and what is that? There's a famous, and I'll repeat it again because I really like it, from something called the Guanzi, which is a very early Chinese spiritual text. And the Guanzi puts a 4-stage formula. It says, what everybody wants to know is that. What is the nature of reality? What is it all about? The second line says, our means of knowing that is this, the human person, our mind and body. The third line is, how can we then know that? And the fourth line is, only by perfecting and cultivating this. So it's a very interesting, everything we know is known through the manner of this. By the way, this is Aquinas, okay? But what the Buddha is saying here, until you transform this, you won't know that. And if you think you know that with this as it is, unexamined, uncultivated, you're not going to see that, but you're going to see a projection of this. So this is like what's going on here. It's really pretty sophisticated, and yet it's very simple. It's like if I picked up the wrong glasses tonight, I wouldn't be able to see you, and I'd make big mistakes. These views about this and that are like that. And so these are fundamental, and they're fundamental not for dogmatic reasons, but because the Buddha said in his experience, in his actual experience, and his experience at that time with fellow cultivators, he saw people having these basic deep views going wrong. Now, they didn't go, some went wrong right at the beginning, starved themselves to death. Thought, oh, this body, here's a view, this body is a prison for my immortal soul. It's a defiled encasement, and the glorious golden light is within. Therefore, if I mortify this body, get rid of it, the release of the eternal soul will take place. And so they starve themselves to death. Buddha said, nah, it doesn't get there. Okay? So then there's all sorts of things, but these views have to do with that relationship between your sense of self, what that's about, and then what you think this is about. Some of the deeper teachings actually say, in the Yogacara teachings, that there is an interactive relationship, that these are not two separate realms. This and that are interacting constantly. And so it's sort of like there is no there specifically outside of the interaction of our sense organs and our sense with the sense objects through our consciousness. So consciousness becomes not just an interpreter of that, but actually a creator of that and a projector of that. So this gets really interesting, and we're getting into very deep stuff here. But what I wanted to go to here was that in this particular phase, I'm guessing from the urgency, Zhu Dao is coming to see the master. And this is tricky because the master's illiterate. And he's reading a sutra, and he's got a pretty refined philosophical question. So, wow, this is, what you see on the news, we always say, Dr. Professor so-and-so says, experts say. We don't say, illiterate Joe Blow from Montana has an idea. And you know what I mean? It's sort of like the predisposition we have for authority is invested either ecclesiastical or academic or political or scientific, right? Anyhow, there are channels that show people who don't have those, but that's another thing. I don't want to go into that. You can watch it if you want. So he comes, he says, I've left home. 10 years he's been studying. 10 years? 10 years is a good time if you're doing this. I know, some of you have been to retreats. Yes? 7 days? 7 days pretty intense, right? First day's cool, second day's a little harder, but the 7 day, you're really grinding in there. Now, what if they extended it 14? You didn't go home. How many of you have done a Chan? Yeah, hands go up. A Guanyin, an Amitabha. Yeah, okay. These are 7 day sessions, very, very disciplined, very strict, the time and sleep and eat. If you just said, you walked in and somebody said, good, you're here. We're going to lock the door for 10 years. Oh, did you get enlightened? No, it was like, goop. Well, he did it for 10 years. So you can imagine he's hot on it. But at the same time, it seems as if, and I'm going to shoot ahead, it seems as if he's got caught himself up in a view. And the view is, we read this before, so I don't want to belabor it, but basically he's created a dichotomy in his mind between the worldly and the world transcending. Okay? Between the human and the beyond the human, which in this case he's calling the Dharma body or the Buddha. In other places people would say it's heaven and human or whatever. But he's created this dichotomy, and now he has a question, and his question is, he calls it the Dharma body and the physical body. So that's, the physical body is this, and the Dharma body is that state that seems to be eternal, everlasting, and so on and so forth. But now he's wondering, because he's saying, well, if the physical body go extinct, then who enjoys the bliss? Because he's cultivating. So if the physical body's gone, I know bliss through this, but I wouldn't know bliss apart from this. So what's going on here? And then he says, so then would that Dharma body go extinct or the physical body go extinct? On the other hand, if the Dharma body is empty, then where is there to set up any place at all? So if you go, the physical body is impermanent, it's born and die, he says. If the Dharma body is permanent, it has no awareness or consciousness. So then he says, the very ceasing of birth and death, arising and perishing is bliss. And now he's really confused. Which body ceases, which body enjoys the bliss? And he goes on, he elaborates like this, okay? And so the Sixth Patriarch listens to this. And I must say, I mentioned this before, this is not unreasonable. Within the framework of this and that, it's not only not unreasonable, it's very logical. And I'd be surprised if somebody hasn't thought this or come to this question themselves. We come here and we learn that true emptiness is wonderful existence. When you reach a place of seeking nothing, attaching to nothing, that itself is Bodhi and Buddhahood. And you're going, okay, that sounds good, but every time I think of not seeking, not grasping, not having anything, the boogeyman comes. And the boogeyman says, nothing, nothing, nothing. And then you freak out and you think, well, tell me that bliss is there a Pure Land someplace that I'm going to? How far away is it? What are the entry fees? And when I know my spiritual bank account is full, that I can rest a little and know that I'll get there? We do all this stuff, right? And if you say, well, now my physical body be gone, how will I know I'm in the Pure Land and enjoying bliss? Because when I eat, I feel my belly's full, and when I sleep, but if there's no body to enjoy it, is there really enjoyment? Am I being ripped off here? So it's not an unusual question. And it's not a question here, just have faith. See, this is tricky because this is not faith-based. It is faith-based in the sense that you start with the hypotheses to pursue it. But faith is not the end. It's actually replaced by knowledge or understanding or direct experience. So faith, the text says, is a source of the way, but it's not the end of the way. But you have to start with something. So he is starting with faith. He's going along, but now he has a crisis because he's trying to figure this out. Now, what this gets to is the Sixth Patriarch has this difficult job because if he goes to either extreme, he reinforces his confusion. If he says, no, there is a nirvana and it's really far out and you'll get to enjoy it, then the next question will be, but you said there's no me to da-da-da-da-da. And then if he says, no, there is no you, then he might fall into the, well, why bother to practice at all? There's no cause and effect. There's no me whatsoever. And so basically, I give you a summary of the 62 just now, but I'll show you how that works. The first one, it takes what are called the 5 skandhas, and I'm not going to go over that because you all remember that. Right? I tell by your smiles that you're nervous. Okay. 5 skandhas, quickly. Brenda, can you do it?
I don't know.
Form, feelings, thought or cognition.
Perception.
Well, that's perception. That's the third one. Fourth one? Everybody gets the fourth one, and this is the hard one because it's the hardest one to work on. Anybody? Well, called formations, but it's volition and will. It's the deep, almost unconscious, habitual moving factors in our being. And the last one is consciousness. Broken down, this is a Buddhist way of looking at body and mind. The first one, form, is that which has material, physical presence, occupies space, and is substantial. The other 4 are aspects of mind: feelings, perceptions, cognition, volition, and finally consciousness. So this is where this cultivator begins understanding that these 5 skandhas are somehow him. Now, what happens often in these texts is we say, oh, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We'll make a comment like that. We'll separate the two. Or we'll say, I want to, let's see how they go. My body wanted to, but my mind didn't. Or my mind did want to, my body didn't. Or you say, I think this way and I feel another way, so we separate. We have all these dichotomies between thought and feeling, emotion, intellect, faith and reason, body and mind, all this sort of thing, right? So here what happens is, the first view is that one of these, this skandha, let's say the body, let's just say the body is big and I'm contained in it. So I'm inside this body. That's one view. The second view goes the opposite and says, I am big and that skandha is inside of me. So I'm the container for that. The third one says, that thing itself is me. I am my feelings. I am my body. I'm not in it, and it's not in me. This is like Mickey and the Night Kids, I'm sorry. But it's like, I am it. And then the fourth one says, I exist apart from it. So this body is not me, but I exist apart from this. So you take these 4, and now we're going to do math, and please help me out here. If you take these 4 and you run each skandha through them, you have 5 times 4, which is 20, correct? And then where the view goes, and this is a simplification, I'm just giving you a handle tonight, and we can look at it more. You take it and then you run it through the 3 periods of time. So 3 times 20 is 60. So you say, in the past I was, in the present I was, and in the future I will be. And these are all various views that people set up about what happens to me when I'm born, what happens to me after I die, and it becomes it's not just conjecture, which it is, but it's also profoundly formative on how we orient ourselves and deal with things. For example, I was just at a memorial, and some people say, oh, don't cry, he's in a better place. And, if you're really a smart-ass little kid, or just a smart little kid, you say, and where is that? And how do you know that place? Have you been there? I mean, that's what kids ask. But you can see it's based on, and that the verse is really good about where these views come from emotions and longings and so forth. But nonetheless, if you take them, you multiply them 3 times, and then you add the 2. What are the last 2? That's 60. We have 2 more. The big ones. East and west. No. What? What are the fundamental, what's the fundamental problem he's wrestling with here? Eternalism and nihilism. In other words, the idea that I exist forever and ever and ever, or there's nothing after death. And there's nothing with the lights go on, that's it. These are called the two extremes. And people that take up spiritual practice in the Buddhist time were often driven by these two. A search for that eternal, unchanging, immovable entity, or a belief that there was nothing whatsoever, which then led to a number of other positions. So that's it in short. And I will wait to do next week on the verse, because I was, somehow tonight I was still thinking about this memorial I was at, and I wanted to just, if you're not bored, I'll say a little bit about it. Because I can't claim to be like Jerdal, but I myself have, from a very early age, asked these questions and had the same doubts and whatnot, and try to pursue it as best I could. And I haven't given up. And you could say that's stubbornness or perseverance or stupidity, but I'm still working at it. And along the way, I've had the good fortune to have good teachers, mentors, teachers, and in some cases, even they became friends, and more than that. So it's a multi-level relationship, but they've been very important to me, both for what they could say, but more importantly, how they embodied. And to see something embodied along these lines is much more powerful than the reading of it, because you actually think, okay, it can be done, and I might be able to do it. If you don't see embodiment, it's really hard to think about Buddhahood and Bodhi and all this sort of thing. And so in the last 20 years, I've lost 8 of those mentors. And the cumulative toll of this is powerful. And because on one hand, it stirs this immense sense of gratitude, and then there's this sense of diminishment that I can't go and ask and touch them anymore with my questions. And often my questions are revolving questions, like you asked this last year. Oh, I did? Maybe you didn't explain it well. Or maybe you weren't listening. Or how were you listening? And then it begins a very interesting dialogue. What is it about this answer that you don't like? Huh? Oh, so having lost them, the more recent one I mentioned was colleague, friend, mentor, Henry Rosemont Jr., who is notably a Chinese philosopher, but not Chinese. He's American. He's a tough guy from Chicago. Ran away from school at 15 and started hitchhiking around the country and went to the Korean War as a Marine. And I asked him what were the effects of the Korean War on him. He said there were 2. One, I became a pacifist because of that, and the other, I developed an interest in Asian religion and philosophy from that experience. And then he came back and went back to college and so forth, and became quite eminent and noteworthy. He's published a lot. The 2 I would recommend are his more recent publications. One is the Reader's Companion, a Companion to the Analects. It's a short little book, but it's a wonderful little way to give you an orientation on how to read the Confucian Analects. And the other one is he's most proud of. Ironically, the title should be something, he says, I can't say I'm proud of this because the book is titled Against Individualism. But it's his attempt to create a philosophy of ethics that's not based on individual rights-bearing autonomous beings, but coming out of a more relational view, and not sort of abstract ontological ethics, but real ethics on the basis of our human relationships being the ground for an ethical construct. So it's a very interesting book. Some of his influences on me, he was a teacher of Heng Shui. One of his first teaching position was at Oakland University in Michigan, and Heng Shui was an undergraduate there. And actually, Heng Shui says the first time he heard about the Buddha and got inspired about it was in Rosemont's class, when he described the Buddha's leaving home and awakening. So it's a very interesting thing, how these circles go. But in any event, early on, Henry drew near to us and we to him, and he was actually very instrumental in helping me with my dissertation. I was trying to come up with something because I was going to go back and finish, and he presented this idea, which became a very good idea. Nobody had done research in this area. And then when I was doing research on the East Coast and at Harvard and University of Virginia, he would take the time in his busy schedule to get in his car and drive halfway down from Maryland to meet me halfway up from where I was at this really bad cafe, funky cafe with terrible coffee. He would buy the coffee, we'd sit there for hours going over my manuscript. I mean, he just gave me this kind of time and energy. And every time we invited him here to talk, he came, usually came with his wife and gave wonderful lectures. I mentioned two moments for me that were really instrumental because I wasn't hot on Confucianism because I saw it as a sort of top-down hierarchical controlling mechanism, socially and even spiritually. And had a lot to do with filial piety and devotions and things like this. Being a 60s guy, I wasn't much into, role relationships, and, you have 5 key ones, right? Between the ruler, the officials, and the governed, between husband and wife, parent and child, friend, and brother and sister. Are those the 5? No Confucians here tonight? Okay. He says these are the primary relationships that define us who we are. Between friends, between brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, teachers and students, and the rulers and the ruled, however you want to say that. The emperor or I can't quite say with the current, it's really hard, so whatever our relationship is to our president, that kind of thing. And he said, getting these right is the basis of a good human society and good individuals, and not getting them right is where we all get messed up. And if you think about it, a lot of therapy takes place, and a lot of tension takes place, and revolutions take place around the balance or imbalance of these primary relationships. But he had another idea which is very interesting. The other idea, he said, first of all, he says, this is not hierarchical. It's not that you have the rulers and the ruled, then you have parents and children, blah, blah, blah. He says it's a horizontal relational thing, which is very interesting because I always thought as top-down hierarchical. He said, no, you are at any one time perhaps a brother to a sister, perhaps a father to a child, perhaps a student to a teacher, perhaps a teacher to a student. And he went around and he said, so you are simultaneously in these, and it's not hierarchical, it's horizontal. And he said a very interesting thing, his idea of a self, why he says against individualism, he says, we are not biologically, philosophically, or any other way autonomous monads, autonomous right-bearing individuals that are hermetically sealed against everything. We don't come into this world alone, unless somebody here had a magical birth I don't know about, okay? We don't sustain ourselves alone. Even the food we eat every day has touched hundreds of hands before it comes to our table, okay? And we don't go out alone. And he said, and the idea of what goes on after that, he says, I don't know, but I suspect that's not alone either. But then he said, therefore, we are the sum total of those relationships. The we call a me is not an individual apart from, but actually defined by those relationships. And therefore, he says, if one of those relationships change, we change. I lose a father, part of me is changed forever. I gain a friend, part of me is changed forever. And he says, all our life is a series of just working those, making those better, to make ourselves better people and the world a better place. So this is a very interesting, two things he gave me from Confucianism that I really appreciate that I didn't have before. The other thing that really struck me about him, he primarily was a philosopher. That was his training, Western philosophy and then Chinese philosophy. But he believed philosophy was something to be lived, totally lived and embodied and not simply studied. So he saw philosophy not just a way of life, but a way of living. Therefore, he took every philosophy principle he had, including my Buddhist stuff that I would share with him, and he would try to apply it into the real life of everyday circumstances and into these relationships. conversely, he would look what's happening in those relationships, and he felt something that was genuine. Even often from a grandchild would say something. It would cause him to go back and change his philosophy. Very interesting. No, this principle of Kant can't be true because my grandchild just experienced and shed this. Therefore, this has to be adjusted. That nimbleness back and forth was really fun to be with. And our exchanges often would turn on this back and forth. So I'll just finish with one story tonight as an illustration of, I could tell so much more, but I'll just say this. And I just came back from the memorial. Many people spoke at the memorial. It was in an old Unitarian church in Newport, the oldest, that goes back to Emerson and so forth. And so it's how should I say, studiously non-religious. Because the Unitarians really just try not, the minister was in a difficult position. He was hosting all these people who were friends of Henry's, and all of them were basically one form or another agnostics or falling away this or that, or, anyhow. And so it was almost like he'd have to say, "Oh Lord," and then if there is one, "Bless our souls," if we have them, back and forth kind of. But the people that got up and spoke was really stunning, especially, I must say, his grandchildren and his daughters. I mean, a lot of times you have people that are very famous and accomplished, and they have very stellar renown, but their personal lives are a mess. They don't take care of their children and whatnot. This was not the case with him. And I could tell you some of what they said, but it would, go on too long here. Maybe some other time. But I was struck by uniformly, people came as far as Beijing, Lithuania, California, Hawaii to attend this one-day gathering in honor of him. And I learned a lot. I learned about a quality of a life over a long time that had integrity from beginning to end. Now, he wasn't a saint, and he would be the first to admit it. His daughters would be the first to say that, and his wife especially would say that. But she said he tried to be the best person he could, and in trying to do that, he was trying. For her. For example, he was most generous with meals, and he would invite all kinds of people over for dinner without telling her. And all of a sudden, all these people would show up, and she'd, what? And then she would make up some marvelous meal, and he'd keep doing this. But she said, all that being said, I was never bored. I was never bored in the 60-some years of their marriage. So here's just one story I'll illustrate tonight about an exchange that we had. So it was about probably 20 years ago, we invited Henry out for the first time. At that time, he was smoking heavily. In fact, the reason he passed away was COPD. People know it's chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. And it's when the lungs either can't get enough oxygen, or more the case, they can't expel the CO2. Emphysema is one of those things. And so you're retaining CO2 in your system. So at the end, I actually had the bittersweet experience of being at his bedside, taking care of him as he died. And he was at 46 respirations a minute. Now you think of that. Most of us are doing 15 or 16. He was doing 46. And he still couldn't get enough oxygen. And he was fully oxygenated with all these machines, even still. So this is very, very difficult. And yet, to the very end, he was cogent and lucid in between this. And so the night before he passed, I didn't know this was the night before, he said, come over, and I sat by his bedside, and we had this hour-and-a-half conversation, very, very clear. And that was the last conversation he had. The next morning, he was on his way out. And I'll only tell you one part of the conversation. It was very, very interesting. So I was sitting aside, he was back and forth, and I just started smiling. I said, what are you smiling about? Well, I said, I was thinking about it the other night, because 2 nights before that, he insisted on taking us out to his favorite restaurant down the street, an Italian restaurant, even though he couldn't walk and he couldn't breathe. He gave him all the medicine, put 2 oxygen tanks on his wheelchair, and I wheeled him down the street. and we went to this restaurant, and he just wanted to really celebrate. When friends come up from afar, he says, "Isn't this joy?" This is a Confucian line. And so he said, "You've come from afar. I want to have a joyous moment with you." And I said, "Well, what are you smiling about?" I said, "Well, that night at dinner." Well, I said, "What?" I said, "Well, the thing on the porch that happened." He said, "Well, what do you mean?" So I wheel Henry up to the restaurant, and there's a long porch on the outside. This young, buff guy, comes out, opens the door for Henry. He says, "Oh, old timer, come, welcome." I'll hold the door. He said, No, I'm waiting for my wife. That's okay. He said, "Okay." So he goes down to the end of the porch, pulls out a pack, lights up a cigarette. So I can feel the wheelchair shaking now. Henry is wanting, because one of Henry's principles of Confucianism, it says filial piety only works if the parents know how to be parents. And they don't know how to be parents, and the kids don't know how to be kids, the whole thing screws up. You can't expect kids to obey parents who don't know what they're doing. Okay? And I said, well, what should happen? You should remonstrate. And he quote the passage from Confucius: if the ruler or the parents or whatnot are not acting appropriately, you have a duty to remonstrate. Now he says, you got to be careful when you do this, because it's not always easy. For example, he said you should remonstrate with rulers. However, there's caveats. First of all, they have to be willing to listen. If they're not willing to listen, don't bother. Secondly, you have to have the virtue to be able to deliver it. Because if you don't have it and you're a hypocrite, there's not going to, and then the time has to be right. And he says if none of those factors are there, you can't. But if they're there, then you can. But that still doesn't mean what do you say. So anyhow, so he's wanting to remonstrate. I can feel it. Young man. Of course, the guy he's down there blowing. There's music coming out of the restaurant, and Henry can't get his attention. And I know it's going to happen. I mean, I've seen Henry remonstrate. And he doesn't pull punches. He really doesn't. That ex-Marine thing comes on, and it's like, boom. And so his wife comes up, and we're ready, and then the man comes back down. And again, he holds the door for us to get in. Last blows away. And Henry says, he said, "Marty, wait." Oh, okay. He says, "Young man, I want to commend you on your kindness and consideration for holding the door for this old timer." And the guy's just beaming. He says, "Oh, that's really, yeah, thank you. But now I want to say something." The reason I'm here with this wheelchair and 2 things of oxygen is because I did what you were doing at the end of the porch for 50 years. And the guy's face like, huh. Yeah, no, so we go in, and Joanne says, "Henry, I don't think he wanted to hear that." And so that was the exchange. So we're in, we have the dinner, we go back. And then he said, "Well, you're not telling me why you're smiling about that. You think that was funny that I tried?" I said, "No, it wasn't funny at all." I said, "The reason I'm smiling is because I did the same thing to you 20 years ago." He says, "What do you mean?" See, I would try to use Confucian principles to poke at him, and he would use Buddhist principles to poke at me. It's very interesting. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, about 20 years ago, you came here to give a lecture at Berkeley Buddhist Monastery, and during the break, you stepped out to have a cigarette. And I followed you outside." And he said, "Yeah, and what happened?" I said, "Well, I quoted Confucius to you." He said, "What did you say?" And this is a line from the classic of filial piety or family reverence. It says, let's see, how does it go? "Our arms and legs, our skin, our teeth, and even our hair are received from our parents. We dare not injure them." So I gave him this line. And he said, "Wow, that's a good line. That's really good." This is his line in his bed. And he said, "Absolutely right on." And he said, "And what did I say?" I said, "You said humph, and you just kept smoking." Mind your business. Okay. And so he's like, wow. And he's just sitting there. I said, "So I think Joanne was right. I don't think you really wanted to hear that." And then there was this long pause, and he softened, and he turned to me and said, "No, I just wasn't ready then to accept it." It's a very, very subtle thing. And to the end, what he did, he threw a Buddhist thing back at me, if you think about it. Because in the Lankavatara Sutra says a teaching is not a teaching unless it's appropriate to the individual at the time and place. And so I gave that Confucian teaching, but it wasn't quite appropriate and didn't work. And he gave me back the Buddhist thing that, I wasn't ready to accept it. But it was done so gently. He wasn't saying, no, you shouldn't have said it. But somehow the conditions for me accepting it weren't there. And so we went on and talked about other things. But that night, I went to bed and I was thinking, wow, this is interesting, because if indeed truth is not so much of some absolute thing out there, but somehow a change or transformation that happens within that allows you to accept something that's right before your eyes, then the question isn't, as a teacher, well, am I imparting truth? Am I teaching? But how do we prepare ourselves and others to accept? How do we prepare ourselves and others to be open to that? And that's where I was going to start breakfast. So our breakfast usually consisted of strong coffee, and then I would go out and get these really decadent pastries from this bakery, and Joanne would say, no, well, I guess. And we'd all dive in and we'd have a conversation. But he never came to consciousness that morning, so we weren't able to continue that. But that's so typical of Henry. There was no sense of closure. In fact, from him, closure was it was almost in a Wittgensteinian sense, a wrong question. There is no closure. In the Confucian sense of the Buddhist sense, there's just continuity. And he would say, however you feel in the Buddhist sense, you go on. In the Confucian sense, if I'm the sum total of my relationships, that's a me, then those relationships that go on is the only me that goes on. And whatever was me is in everybody else who goes on ad infinitum in this way. So it was really a kind of thoughtful, and at the same time, I was like, to have even an expectation of closure was really not how it really plays out, and wasn't even necessary. So I just share that story with you on the friend and colleague and mentor who's, I won't say passed away, just moved, shifted somehow. But I will say for me, the way I've made peace with these 8 teachers that have passed away was that somehow parts of them still are retained in me in various degrees, and not as clearly as good as they were in them. But I think that's true of everyone here. Tennyson has a great line in Ulysses where he says, we are part of every place we've been and part of every person we've met. And that sense is, kind of like that interconnectedness is very, very real, and then it makes you, actually gets you into a bodhisattva mind automatically because you can't get out of that. Even if you pull away, you're affecting somebody. So it's like an interesting kind of thing. So I'll end there tonight. Next week, we'll go into the 62 and into this wonderful verse. But we'll stop for tonight. Any questions, comments? Yes?
I just have a question. It says your mentor passing away. Is a cultivator understanding the principles should you feel sorrow?
The what?
Should you feel sorrow? Understanding the principle and the cultivator?
Everybody understand the question? If you're a cultivator and somebody passes away dear to you, should you feel sorrow? My answer would be, if you're a cultivator and you don't feel sorrow, you're not a cultivator. Really. And I say this with all due respect for people, because I don't think in fact, next week we'll go into this because it's right in the verse. It doesn't mean you don't have feelings or emotions. It just means you're not controlled by them. And you have them appropriately. You don't over them and you don't under them. Because I don't think you can get awakened outside of feelings and emotions. But the difference is what you set up in them. Do you identify them as you? Do you hang on to them? Or do you repress them? Neither, and that's really between eternalism and nihilism. So you have to actually learn how to use them. You can't get awakened outside of that body, that mind, those feelings and emotions. If there was another way, you get in some rocket ship and you go up to Pure Land, it doesn't matter. No. So somehow then, if that's true, we have to really start looking at our emotions, how we use them, how we abuse them, and so forth, because it's the refinement of the emotions, not the repression of them, that leads to the full person, and the full person then becomes a Buddha. By perfecting our humanity, Buddhahood happens by itself, not by repressing it. So this is worthy of study. And I think for me, when I meant by embodiment, I saw emotions embodied in a refined way in my mentors in different ways. Even my Buddhist mentor, who I considered the most accomplished, would cry at times. And not because he didn't get his way or because of something else, it is because somehow a kindness and compassion would come up for a situation where that was probably the most appropriate response. But what happened was it didn't stop there. The action that followed that response was usually therapeutic and changing a situation. For example, just briefly, we were in Malaysia, the refugees from the Vietnam situation were boat people and were being turned back from the shores of Malaysia back to sea to be either drowned or face pirates. And the government of Malaysia wasn't accepting them. At that point, my teacher had a tear in his eye, appropriate to the situation, because you imagine these are women and children and kids being thrown back out. Then he said, after that, we have such a large place at the city of 10,000 Buddhas. We should turn this into a refugee and rescue resettlement place. And we should bring these people over here and do that right here at our place. And so that emotion, appropriate response, then turned into action. And so it wasn't just beating the chest and say, oh, how sad it's sad and sorry for them, nor was it repressing it. But the full impact of that, taking that, then transforming that into expedient, wise action, I think is kind of what we're called to do. Because in a sense, it's really easy to repress. And it's really easy to indulge. But in the end, it's just an outflow and it doesn't lead anywhere. Either one's an outflow. And so to turn that into constructive action means you transform this into something. And that's what it means to change afflictions into bodhi. So it's a good question, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of emotions in spiritual cultivation. Yeah. I can't imagine Guan Yin, like, whatever. You know, Guan Yin, the compassionate bodhisattva, is listening to the sounds of the world. Not like earbuds on. You know, listening to the sounds of the world. So listening to the sounds of the world, to actually feel what that is and be able to respond appropriately, you have to take that in. It can't be an imagined listening to the world or projected listening to the world. You actually have to feel that. Okay, enough. But any announcements?
Regular classes are all going on. Next week is not Buddhism Modern Mind, right? 2 weeks from now is Buddhism Modern Mind.
Okay, so every other Monday that class meets?
Yeah, every other Monday.
Okay.
Otherwise, I don't think there's anything. Actually, this Tuesday, the Vietnam monks will be coming.
Okay, these are monks from the forest tradition.
Yeah, this Tuesday.
Here.
Ajahn I believe, will be coming now.
Okay.
But
Anything else? Classes are continuing at the city, as usual. Let's see what else. Any special vegetarian food tomorrow?
not about special, but every day is special.
You just got back from the East Coast as well?
I just got back.
Did you fan the flames of discontent there, or what did you do?
No, we were, they had Emperor Liang Repentance.
In,
So they invited our master Lai to go, and so I accompanied him.
uh,
Yeah.
okay.
All good.
Any other announcements? Okay, we'll do the transference in English. Remember we do, not the new one, the old English version.
Hearts of goodness,